it really doesn't matter what you know about the specificities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you live in South Africa, if you live in Namibia, if you live in Bangladesh, if you live in wherever you live, you know that you are on the good side, not the right side, but the good side of history, if you remain solidaristic to Palestine. Because in the end, unless the Palestinians are free, none of us are free. Despicable. We Europeans are despicable now. And I think my country is a good example. Within hours of my resignation, the Greek Prime Minister dispatched the foreign minister to Tel Aviv to embrace Netanyahu and start a big love affair between Greece and Israel. How did the United States come to be? Through genocide of the natives, through slavery and genocide. Now, in that sense, Israel is simply trying to replicate in the land of Palestine.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to our shows, do hit that subscribe button. You can also donate in the link given in the description box, be a YouTube member by hitting the join button, or be a Patreon by following the link. That helps us sustain ourselves. But the easiest thing you can do is to watch our shows, hit like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis is the former finance minister of Greece, an economist, a politician, and a political analyst. Yanis, welcome back to India and Global Left.
It's a great pleasure to be back. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with Palestine. It has been a year since Israel started its attempt to make Gaza unlivable. Now we are also seeing escalation of this conflict across the region with the war or the likely war with the axis of resistance in the Middle East. Can you share your thoughts about what this last 1 year has taught us in terms of the conflict itself?
What it has done is it has made it abundantly clear that the West, in the United States, one-party state effectively with its two factions, the Democrats and the Republicans, and the whole of the European Union, with some very small, bright exceptions like Ireland, for instance, and maybe Spain, are totally complicit in the genocide. That's the first lesson. There are no excuses now, after 1 year of this unrelenting genocide, for the West to be arming and backing Israel in this campaign of terror, horror, death, and destruction in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and now in South Lebanon. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is that it is not Netanyahu. You can see that even after 1 long year of this orchestrated misanthropism, Netanyahu manages to have total control of the Knesset, of the parliament in Israel. So it's not just, a Likud coalition with the fascist parties of the settlers. It's the whole of the Knesset. Not the whole, but the crushing majority of the Knesset. Last July, the International Court of Justice ruled, as it should, and it has done many times in the past, that the occupied territories are illegally occupied and that Israel should evacuate them, must evacuate them. This is what international law decrees. And 5 days later, the Knesset voted 65 to 9, that this is the land of Israel. In other words, defying international law and stating that there will never be a Palestinian state, against even what Joe Biden says. So the United States, the West, the crushing majority of the political spectrum in Israel are complicit in a genocide which knows no bounds. They've killed 200,000 people in Palestine, if you include the people who succumbed to their wounds after being bombed, and not just the 40,000 who died instantly, but 200,000 have died as a result of the bombings and the malnutrition and the lack of water and the lack of medicine. And it's not clear to me, I don't know whether you agree or not, but that even if that number was not 200,000, but it was, 2 million, the West would remain apathetic, the West would remain complicit, and so would the Knesset. So we are talking about a fully fledged genocide with the support of the powers that be in Europe, in the United States, and in Israel. And the third lesson is that the spirit of resistance that the Palestinians have done so much and they have sacrificed so much to keep alive has become a bellwether for humanity's capacity to retain a connection with its basic moral principles. So there's today, it really doesn't matter what you know about the specificities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you live in South Africa, if you live in Namibia, if you live in Bangladesh, if you live in wherever you live, that you are on the good side, not the right side, but the good side of history, if you remain solidaristic to Palestine. Because in the end, unless the Palestinians are free, none of us are free.
I want to ask you about Europe itself and what the Palestinian question leaves us in terms of Europe. We have seen huge shift of what Noam Chomsky once called the international consensus back in the 70s regarding the Palestinian question. We have seen huge deepening and widening of that international consensus, largely from the global south. We have seen Nicaragua, Colombia, Turkey, South Africa. I can go on. And there have been dishonorable exceptions, like India, some Central Asian republics that are still sending oil and natural gas. Comment on that if you like, but my question to you is on Europe. Europe has been the architect of this conflict with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, officially the greatest empire endorsing the Zionist project. And as Khalid Rashidi and others tell us, that it was not until coming of Hitler that the Zionists actually got a practical justification of their grotesque settler colonial project. We have seen some positive developments recently in Europe, Spain in particular, but also Norway, Ireland, and Slovenia recognizing full Palestinian statehood. But we are also seeing the extremes in Germany, in Serbia, and so on, Hungary. Can you comment about what this conflict does to Europe?
Well, it has condemned our soul to the hottest fires of hell. To make it a not too dramatic point. We are despicable. We Europeans are despicable now. And I think my country is a good example, because Greece was an outlier in Europe in the sense that even right-wing governments were refusing to recognize Israel up until the 1990s. I grew up in a Greece which was constantly in the hands of the right wing, sometimes the extreme fascistic right wing. And yet, even those right wing governments were refusing to recognize Israel until there is a Palestinian state. So it was only in the early 1990s that Greece officially recognized. So that also, since we also have the war in Lebanon as we speak, in 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, very much as it is doing today, back then to eradicate the PLO, today to eradicate Hezbollah. The Greek prime minister at the time was a social democrat, socialist, Andreas Papandreou. He sent the Greek Navy to Beirut to evacuate the Palestinian leadership. The Greek Navy, a European country's navy, went to Beirut to evacuate the Palestinians and save them and brought them to Greece. And Arafat came to Greece, and there was, 500,000 people in the street welcoming. Where is Greece now? The day after I resigned in 2015 from the government. I was a Minister of Finance until the night of the 5th of July 2015, when my Prime Minister essentially surrendered to the International Monetary Fund, to the European Central Bank, to the powers that be, the West. And I resigned that night. Why am I mentioning that? Because within hours of my resignation, the Greek Prime Minister dispatched the Foreign Minister to Tel Aviv to embrace Netanyahu and start a big love affair between Greece and Israel. And effectively, Greece became Israel's lackey in the Eastern Mediterranean. As we speak, our agricultural land, many parts of our cities are being purchased by Israeli capital. The Israeli Air Force is using Greek airspace in order to train, because they don't have enough of broad enough, wide enough airspace in Israel to do it. The Greek government is completely complicit in the genocide of the Palestinians. I'm mentioning that because this is the Greek outlier from one extreme, the right way of respecting the Palestinians' aspirations for self-determination. We've swung to the other side. The pendulum has gone to the other side. So this is just one example, but allow me to make a more general point. People ask me, what are the Israelis doing? What do they think they will do? The answer is they think that they will get away with the kind of crimes that the Europeans got away with. Because when the Europeans went to India, when they went to South Africa, when they went to, in India, they didn't go as settlers so much, more as colonialists, but in South Africa, they went as colonists, as settlers. Similarly, in Kenya, similarly, of course, in Australia. And Australia is a brilliant example because they legalized the genocide the moment they arrived in Australia. They declared the land to be terra nullius, an empty land, a land without a people, for a people without a land. And well, that's the Zionist notion. So, how did the United States come to be? Through genocide of the natives, through slavery and genocide. Now, in that sense, Israel is simply trying to replicate in the land of Palestine that which the British, the Germans, the Dutch, the French did in their empire. So it's not a great surprise, really, that European regimes and American regimes support Israel. Israel is simply trying to copy them. One would have thought, and this is a great disappointment of a European like me, that we Europeans, at least, managed to be self-critical, sometime in the 1960s and 1970s, with decolonization, to become critical of colonialism, critical of imperialism, and essentially to do our mea culpa, to admit that we were part of a brutalizing empire project, and that we've learned our lessons, but it seems that we have not learned our lessons, because when Germany today, hiding behind the fight against anti-Semitism, which is a fight that is very dear to my heart. We must all fight anti-Semitism. But the German government, the German political regime is hiding behind the fight against anti-Semitism in order to legitimize and support every war crime that Israel chooses to commit against the Palestinians. As if, two genocides make one right. So I'm appalled by Europe. I'm absolutely appalled. And I'm appalled why? Because we have gone back to the imperialist colonial attitudes, which I had hoped when I was a younger man had been eradicated in Europe.
You mentioned about Germany. I wanted to ask you about the German economy in particular. It contracted last year by 0.3%. The recent estimate is that it's going to contract again this year. And this has been done significantly apart from the long-term causes in the short run, the conflict in Russia that has led to severe supply chain disruption along with energy shortages. The finance minister of Germany, Robert Habeck, said on Wednesday that Germany also cannot have the leeway of increasing government spending because there are constitutional limitations of that. Can you explain why Germany has been particularly performing poorly in terms of its economic indicators?
The problem with the German economy than any economic indicator suggests. This is not a recession. Recessions come and go under capitalism. What Germany is experiencing is a complete, irreversible collapse of its business model, of its industrial model. The reason is very simple. For 17 years now, there's been no investment in Germany. Zero. They've been sitting on their laurels. They've been using austerity and competitive austerity in order to maintain their net exports, to maintain the competitiveness, because when you suppress your wages, you can charge lower prices to the Indians, to the Chinese, and so on for your goods. Of using austerity to increase competitiveness of your industrial products, at some point runs out of steam. And what is that point? It's the point when, after 15, 17 years, as I said, of no investment, the Chinese come along and the Americans come along with a technological revolution, a shift to a different kind of product, like electric vehicles, in which you have not invested. So for BMW now, for Volkswagen, to try to compete with Tesla or BYD, this is like a company making typewriters, electric typewriters in the 1970s, trying suddenly to produce personal computers. It can't be done. If you have not invested in good time, you will not make the transition from typewriters to personal computers. Similarly, electric vehicles are not just an evolution of conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. They are a totally different proposition. They're a completely different thing. So this is just one example. So when it comes to green energy, solar panels, and so on, they didn't invest anything. So now they've missed out on one gigantic technological revolution. And no, even if wages are pushed to zero now, even if Germany goes to slavery and German workers very happily work for nothing, again they cannot compete because they've missed that technological revolution. And allow me a personal note on this. The reason why I got into politics was because around 2006, 2008, 2010, around then, I could see that the collapse of Wall Street, the great financial crisis that hit us in 2008 globally, was always going to produce a new version, a postmodern version of the 1930s. And remember, in the 1930s, it was all focused on the Weimar Republic, on Germany. The business model of Germany had collapsed. Austerity was being practiced. And the only beneficiaries were the fascists. This is what's happening again. Of course, history doesn't repeat itself nicely, but unfortunately it rhymes, as they say. And now you have a German nationalism, a xenophobia, a racism, an Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, all rising up in Germany as a result of the collapse of the business model in ways that are far too reminiscent of what was going on in the 1920s and 30s.
I think a good segue from this is the stagnation in investment in upgrading technology, or for that matter, labor productivity, is tied to German capital, but European capital largely getting an alternative way of jacking up profit through finance capital. Can you explain very briefly what happened to European capital as it gave up on its profit-driven model based on industry in, let's say, the 90s, 2000s? What were the alternative ways that came up with tremendous pumping of liquidity, debt rising, Can you explain that mechanism for us? Because we have been discussing sovereign debt crisis, particularly for the global south, with various economists like Jayatiko, CP Chandrasekhar, and others. And a lot of people want to know, why do many countries cannot sustain debt while, let's say, the US can sustain an enormous debt?
Yes. Well, let's be clear on the major peculiarity.
You are on mute, Yanis.
Yes.
Can you repeat?
Sorry. I'll start again. I'll start again. I'll start again. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm just not feeling 100%. Okay. The great peculiarity of the European economy since the 1950s was that the way in which the European economic community, which then turned into the European Union, was constructed, its architecture, it was like a cartel of big business. It began as a cartel of steel and coal, and then automobiles and the electrical goods industry, and then the farmers, the large-scale farmers, came in with a common market, the common agricultural policy. So it all became effectively a large cartel, which was very centrally managed. This is why we needed the common currency, because a cartel needs to trade in one currency. You can't have variable exchange rates, because it destabilizes the cartel. This is why we created the euro without a federation, which made the cartel even more unstable, because federal surplus recycling mechanisms stabilize a cartelized capitalist economy. So we didn't even have that. And in the 1980s, 1990s, two were the major characteristics of the European economy. The first was that our growth depended on net exports. So essentially, the European Union became a larger Germany. And those exports went primarily to the United States, So the United States deficit, trade deficit, provided Europe with a demand, the requisite demand, for maintaining its net export model. Now that, for the global south, was significant, because Europe was essentially exporting deflation. It was exporting unemployment to the global south, because this is what you do when you have a large surplus. You're essentially siphoning off the rest of the world demand. And if you siphon off demand, you are exporting deflation and unemployment. So Europe has been, even during the good days of the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s, Europe was an impediment to development in the global south, and increasingly reliant on the trade deficit of the United States. Then in 2008, just because in the 10 years before that, the German and the French and the British banks, the main banks of Europe, had become so enmeshed with Wall Street and had bet gigantic amounts of borrowed money they had borrowed from the Americans, which they invested. They spent on betting in the American financial markets. The subprime market is just one example, but not the only one. So when in 2008 Wall Street comes down, Wall Street is saved by the American central bank, the Federal Reserve, but Europe did not have an equivalent, because the European Central Bank was not allowed to do the job of saving in the same way that the Federal Reserve was. So it was the burdens created, all these bets that went south in the banking sector of Europe, all these burdens were transferred onto the shoulders of the weakest citizens in Europe. That was massive austerity. Okay, so the only way after 2008, 2009, a country like Germany could continue to accumulate surpluses was by enhancing even further its exports to countries like India and primarily China. So the export of deflation, of crisis from Europe to the global south increased exponentially. Exponentially. Now we're in a situation where this model in Europe, as I said before, focusing on Germany, is falling apart. So Europe is becoming increasingly irrelevant to the global south, to the global north, to anyone. If you talk to people from the government of Mexico, the government of India, the government of China, they look at Europe with a sense of wonder. I mean, what are these people doing this? What on earth are the Europeans doing? Why are they becoming so irrelevant? So essentially, we've become a very rich, very wealthy, large economic bloc, which is like a ball in chain for the rest of humanity. We need to acknowledge that. The political fragmentation and the political and moral decrepitude of Europe is a reflection of the collapse of our economic model, a model that was set up essentially by the United States after 1950, 1948, because let's face it, the European Union was a design, a Washington design. It wasn't a European design, whatever the Europeans may think. I think especially people in the global south must understand this in those terms and must focus now on the great threat that presents itself to the global south, which is the intensifying Cold War between the United States and China, which is also the result, to some extent, not fully, to some extent, of the decline of Europe.
I think this brings me to a question or a discussion on China itself. I mean, I'm aware that you are not a China economist, but as someone who looks at the global economy, you mentioned about this, and you have written about the recycling mechanism. China took over the recycling mechanism in a significant part, although not entirely. And obviously, it has to be stated right at the outset that in the last 40, 45 years, China has been the most exciting and most successful economic miracle in recent human history, lifting not just people out of poverty, but essentially fomenting an occupational transfer from agriculture into its cities, giving people more roads, houses, buildings, food, education, health, and so on. But there has been recent discussion broadly about the general macroeconomic slowdown to about 4 or 5%. It has to be stated that Europe grew at roughly 1% since 2008. So we have to keep that in mind. So we are talking about the slowdown as 4 to 5%. Nevertheless, that has been there. There has been the property sector, which has been talked about, and a stock market where it seems that it's return hasn't been enough to attract global investors, and the Chinese are doing a lot. But my question to you is, has that broad model of countries tapping into or plugging into global supply chain to export and then producing for the global export market, has it run out of steam? And if it has, then what's the way forward for the global south? Because a lot of countries essentially have a model of growing by exporting. What's your thought on that broad trajectory of where global economy is heading to?
Well, whatever we may think and say about competitive advantage and export growth and all that, the big elephant in the room is the attempt by the United States government, actually both parties, Trump and Biden so far, and Trump and Kamala Harris, whoever wins later. I think they're completely united in this, in fighting a trade war against China and a technological war against China, and fingers crossed, not a thermonuclear war, but that is not outside the realm of possibility, unfortunately. I think that whatever the economics of the global economy might be, this is a political decision, which, as I said, it is the big elephant in the room. And I can talk to you about this ad nauseum as to why I think this is happening, but this is not your question. Your question is more to do with, the Chinese model and what can you expect of it and whether it is a good model for other countries to follow. Well, let me make the point that the International Monetary Fund model of the structural adjustment programs imposed in Asia and in Africa in the 1970s and 80s, where effectively a population is told, we'll get rid of your schools, your universities, your hospitals, your people will live in dire poverty, but you will grow food to export and to make hard currency. Okay, that's not a growth model. This is an underdevelopment model. This is a development of underdevelopment, as we leftists used to say, right? So this is certainly not the model. The Chinese model is a development model. And you can, I was in Shanghai 2 weeks ago. It is clear you have to be totally blind and deluded not to recognize that China is a great success story with its problems, its conundrums, and so on. The problem with China is twofold. You can put it in macroeconomic terms, pure sort of technocratic macroeconomic terms, or in Marxist terms, or both. So I will do both. In macroeconomic terms, when you have net exports, when you have a trade surplus, which is as large as China's, that necessarily means that aggregate demand domestically is not high enough. And therefore, you are forced to make investments in your domestic economy that are not productive and they are not socially necessary. So you invest in things that you should not have invested in. This is this is a statement of fact. It's not even a question of opinion. If you have constant trade surpluses, then domestic aggregate demand, by definition, is going to be lower than it should be in order to be able to ensure that your investments are not contributing to problems rather than to solutions. The solution to that is not to export. The solution to that is to import more from the global south, in particular, in order to create demand for the products of other nations and countries. That's the macro, if you want, imbalances story. In Marxist terms, trade wars are class wars, essentially, because when you have, a lot of aluminum metals being produced in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and being exported to the United States, where does the United States stuff? It prints dollars. It's IOUs, the Federal Reserve prints the money and gives it to the Chinese capitalist. And then what does the Chinese capitalist do? The Chinese capitalist takes the dollars and brings them back to the United States and invests in US Treasury bills, in government debt in the United States, or buys real estate in Miami or in California, right? And what allows the Chinese capitalist to do that? The fact that he keeps his workers' wages low. That's why I'm saying a trade war is a class war. And the great problem that Xi Jinping has in China, Xi Jinping knows what I just said. I'm sure he does. And it's clear from his pronouncements for years now that he wants to reduce the level of investment, to reduce the trade surplus, and to increase consumption. He knows that. But in this, he's got two problems. The first one is you don't want to reduce investment in the things that you need more of. So, for instance, in schools, in universities, in even roads, in fast trains and stuff, you don't want to reduce that. R&D, you want to invest more on that, but you want to invest less in the property bubble. So you want to deflate the property bubble. And you want to reduce the wasteful investment in producing ultra cheap aluminum for the United States. But there you have 2 or 3 class enemies in your own country. You have the capitalists who produce the aluminum, who do not want to see a rebalancing of the economy in that manner. You have the real estate sector, the rentiers who kick and scream every time house prices come down, and house prices should come down because they were ridiculously high. And you have the bankers who are constantly striving for more liberty for them to do stuff. And you must never, never liberate the bankers. A free society means that the bankers must be slaves of the society. Freedom for the bankers is slavery for the world. Let me be very clear on this. So for me, China is a great success story, but it is a story in flux. Nothing is settled. And what I find fascinating as a Marxist is that it is the locus of a massive class conflict within China. And that makes it fascinating for me.
I think this is my last question. I want to end by returning to the Palestine question. We have been asking many commentators and analysts on the Middle East about a very difficult question about some of the possible ends to this conflict. I wanted to pick up on one specific thing that you mentioned in one of your talks, which was the labor question in Israel. You said that Israel, unlike many of the former cases of slavery and apartheid, has essentially freed itself out of its dependence from the Palestinian question. Now, that might not be entirely true for certain specific sector. Like there has been recent reports about 160,000 Palestinian workers from the occupied West Bank's permits being canceled, which has been leading to massive crisis in the construction sector, for instance. But I found the broader picture that you said that Israel's own economic reforms creating a proletarian class within itself, but also high growth since the 2000s, inviting more labor from outside, has essentially enabled itself to free from its dependency on Palestinian labor. Can you spell that out? Because it's essential in order to understand that this struggle against apartheid is significantly greater than maybe some of the previous cases.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. The point I made, and I'm very happy to remake here, is that, as somebody who was involved in the anti-apartheid movement when I used to live in Britain, in very difficult times, I have to remind our viewers that in 1978, 1979, 1980, 1981, the United States and Britain had branded Nelson Mandela a terrorist. Those of us who were supporting the ANC and Nelson Mandela were being denounced, very much like today. We were being denounced as terrorist enablers and apologists for terrorism. And the campaign to boycott, divest, and sanction the white supremacists of the South African Pretoria regime was a very difficult one. In the end, it worked. It worked when British Petroleum, when various companies started withdrawing, and so on. And people say to me today that, that means that our struggle to liberate Palestine and end apartheid in Israel, Palestine, is doomed to win, to succeed. And I say to people, no, it's not. We must never make the mistake of thinking that just because we succeeded in the case of South Africa, we will succeed in the case of Israel. We have to keep trying, and I want to remain hopeful that we will win. But we have to understand, to win, we need to understand and to appreciate that this is harder, a harder nut to crack. Israeli apartheid is much harder. And the point I've been making is that if you think back to the days of the apartheid regime in South Africa, well, what was the main driver of the economy in South Africa was the mines that utilized massive quantities of black labor, the factories, yeah, and the service sector, including having blacks to clean your home if you were a white supremacist, right? Essentially, for every one white supremacist, there had to be 20 blacks working. Okay, therefore, the point I made was that the South African apartheid regime needed black workers. They tried to fence them inside the various Bantustans, the various reservations, as the Americans did with the natives. But they needed these to be close to the factories, close to the mines, close to their homes, and to have open doors so that they can go, maybe on a minibus to the near white settlement and work in the shops, work in the houses, work in the mines, and so on. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the massive emigration of Russian Jews and Kazakh Jews and Ukrainian Jews and so on to Israel, there was the importation, especially Jews coming from Arab countries as well. A new worker proletarian was imported. It was as if they imported a large Jewish proletarian, which could replace and has replaced to a very large extent Palestinian labor. Yes, you're right. Something between 100 and 200,000 Palestinians continue to work, especially in the construction industry. But that, Netanyahu switched that off on the 7th of October, 2023. Effectively, as part of the collective punishment of Palestinians, they were not allowed to go into Israel to work. But that was doable for him. Unlike in South Africa. South Africa, they would never have stopped the blacks from being proletarians, wage proletarians. In Israel, they did. And don't forget that Israel has the capacity that European countries have to bring in migrants. We heard, and part of the tragedy of the 7th of October was that there were people from the Global South, workers from the Global South, that fell victim to the attacks by Hamas. Remember the Thais? What were the Thais doing in South Israel, just north of the Gaza prison camp? What were they doing there? They were precariat. They were precariously employed Global South people, workers. Israel can bring in another 200,000 like that tomorrow to replace the construction workers that it has lost. So the point I'm making is that it is the struggle against the second apartheid is harder than the struggle against the original one.
We'll leave it there on that fascinating but pessimistic note. Yanis Varoufakis, thank you very much for your time. You were not fully well, but you were very generous with your time. And we hope to discuss more next time you're back.
Well, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Yanis.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.